So yes, I am very late with this recap and review of Severance Season 3, Episode 7, Sweet Vitriol. I watched the episode after going to a screening for Bong Joon-ho's Mickey 17, and I think that affected the way I received the plot. I appreciated Sweet Vitriol's simplicity and deep character exploration. The episode justified Cobell's heavy presence in Season 1 and provided further context for her future participation in subsequent episodes. In Season 1, Cobell was the central antagonist, whose motivation was at best explained through vague loyalty for a company that ultimately rejected her for her perceived incompetence. At every turn, she was rejected, with Lumen's board constantly rebuffing her idea that integration was possible. Even after being fired, Cobell still makes efforts to ensure Lumen was aware of the activation of the overtime contingency fee. Not the contingency fee, that is a lawyer term, overtime contingency. Sweet Vitriol allows us to explore why someone would go to such extreme lengths over everything related to the severance procedure. There's also something to be said about how the plot occurs outside of Lumen's offices, which, like the last episode, Chikai Bardo, Sweet Vitriol allows us to have a wider idea of the world that Severance existed, which is also super important. And I think this is also a reason why we see this image of Lumen as the thumbnail for the video for the episode. Even though nothing about Lumen happens there, it's kind of showing how oftentimes these corporations can have these huge contrasts between their nice pristine offices, corporate offices, and how people actually work on a day-to-day basis. As somebody who primarily knows white-collar workers, right, there's a huge difference between somebody who works at Amazon corporate versus the person who's working every single day to make sure your packages actually arrive at your doorstep. And so it kind of brings to the forefront how these companies are able to operate by virtue of at least exploiting some people at the bottom. And for Lumen, that quite literally means child labor. I also do want to talk, something fell. I'm going to let it fall and we're just going to continue. I do want to talk about, however, this idea of Lumen being a uterus. I still think that that's very important. Of course, in this episode of Sweet Vitriol, we see the idea of mother and daughter. So, Harmony Cobell literally came from the uterus of her mother. But I think there's also something to be said about, again, this show wants us to focus and remember that birth and rebirth is a huge part of what they're doing. And before I get into more about specifics in the episode recap, I want to share my theory as to why this episode felt so slow to so many people. And this is something that's actually been bothering me for a while, so let's go ahead. I think the lore and reality of Lumen is a lot simpler than people assume. I think people are assuming that the show is this deeply entangled sci-fi, when in fact it likely has a very simple conceit that is enhanced by the idiosyncratic conflicts of the main characters. The characters and their development is more important to the plot of the show than the mysteries held by Lumen. When everything about Lumen becomes clear, it's going to be important that we as the audience care about how these revelations affect the main characters, and more so than we're stunned by the reality of the technology and its intended use. So I think we have a lot of people saying, well, what are the goats for? What is Lumen trying to do? And I think it's going to be interesting and important, but I think the point of the show is actually far more about the people themselves than it is about the technology. And so yeah, I think that one of the reasons why this was so important is because Cobell is clearly going to play a huge role in future episodes, but we need to actually understand why she's as invested as she is, so they needed to do that. Sweet Vitriol is an example of the show reinforcing our attachment to the characters and solidifying their motivations before the plot escalates. I do hope we actually eventually get to see also some exploration into Rigavi's backstory, because that would be helpful, but until then, let's examine Harmony Cobell. The show opens with images of waves hitting against a rocky shore. Beautiful shots are provided of a cold harbor that contains a small town of Salt's Neck where Cobell is driving to. Harmony Cobell is brushing her teeth behind a store when she sees a man huffing a substance in an abandoned and worn-out vehicle. She gets a call from Devin Scout, but she ignores him. The episode transitions to a cafe where everyone seems to have piercing blue eyes. This was just something that really rocked me. I don't know why, but I was just like, why is everyone's eyes like that? And anyway, maybe it was the ether. The ether did something. A man complains about a snowplow incident. The server provides commentary and gives the man a bottle of the substance we saw the man earlier puff. We learn later that the server's name, here pictured, is Hampton. Cobell's car pulls up and we see the cafe is called Drippy Pot Cafe. When Cobell enters the cafe, it appears that the patrons in Hampton recognize her. Cobell is cold and is not willing to participate in niceties. Instead, she forces Hampton to buy her a cup of coffee so she could sit at the table. Again, some really beautiful shots here of the patrons serendipitously taking peeks at Cobell. Cobell comments that the town is older than she remembers, and Hampton explains the reason for the dilapidation with articulate finance language. So we get an idea that Hampton is very well educated, he's just, down on his luck. Cobell then asks Hampton for a favor that can only be detailed at the factory. Hampton agrees and we see more of the town. The town seems to have a lot of buildings that once belonged to Lumen. Hampton greets Cobell at the factory by stating how fucked it is to ask him to meet him there. Cobell says she needs him to drive her to Sissy's. Cobell believes that Lumen is following her and she needs to go to the house in another car. The server says, Hampton says, that Sissy still lives by the 9 in reference to the Lumen core principles, which again relays a mix of religious and corporate influence of Lumen. Sissy is explicitly described as a social pariah of the town. Cobell needs to get something and he says he could stay in the truck during the duration of the visit. Cobell describes them as prior chums and colleagues, which Hampton rebuffs was simply child labor. I think this is a really interesting thought, especially recently. I love this podcast called Behind the Bastard, and they reviewed the story of Tony Alamo, or Robert Evans did, and Tony Alamo was a cult leader who sold jackets made with child labor. There's a long history of religious corporate institutions using child labor to make a profit. Another loophole is schools, which we see something like that depicted in Nickel Boys, which is the movie adaptation of the book by Colson Whitehead, which I've also read. But it's a true story about how a reform school used children to make profit through these works by saying, oh, these children are working at this job and it's going to help enhance their reformation. But really it was just an opportunity for a lot of people to make money off of boys who had nowhere else to be. Cobell says Keir and Imogen met at Ether Mill, implying that there was a romantic backstory to Hampton and Cobell's story that mirrored Keir and Imogen's story. Cobell says that she will not be the punching dummy for Hampton's resentments about Lumen. We then see that Cobell is hiding in the trunk of Hampton's truck, so we get to know that he did, in fact, help her. And again, Cobell is getting a call from Devin. Before we continue, I will say I was a bit iffy on some of the acting choices taken by Patricia Arquette throughout this episode. It felt like she couldn't really make Cobell's emotions complex. They were just so abrupt and intense at every moment. I just wish that there was a more complexity and more of, a gradation between different sort of expressions of emotions that she had here. Hampton wants Sissy to drop dead, suggesting that Sissy's impact on their life was a sheer violation. Sissy warmly greets Cobell by saying, "You're not welcome here." That's a joke if you didn't get it. That's a joke. Hee hee ha ha, please. That's a moment to laugh. Cobell runs past Sissy to go upstairs to her childhood bedroom. Sissy berates Cobell for bringing Hampton to her home, and he calls him a huff peddler. Cobell rebuffs that Sissy was the one that gave him a taste for it. This is important because it displays how, despite their righteous tone, Lumen followers are steeped in hypocrisy. And we saw that with Bert as well. So I think that this might be a common thread amongst Lumen followers. We see a plaque in the hallway commemorating Sissy for being a quarterly striver for the year of Vision. Vision is one of the 9 core Lumen principles, so we should pay attention to how that might affect Lumen's priorities. So we don't know what principal year we're in, but that might give us a sense as to why they decided to go full activation mode when it comes to Severance. I also would note that Sissy does have Cobell's last name. Her last name is Cobell. My theory, and a lot of people have said a lot of theories about Sissy, my theory is that Sissy is Cobell's aunt. So that's her role. Anyway, Sissy claims Cobell's childhood items were sold. Sissy confirms that Mr. Drummond has called her, and then Cobell unplugs Sissy's phone and demands a key to her mother's room. Harmony says that Sissy cursed their house with woe. Sissy slaps Cobell after Cobell claims that Sissy pulled the tube from her mother's gullet. We then get confirmation that Cobell's mother was not a believer in Lumen principles. Sissy reminds Cobell that she was the one who had to listen to the wheezing while Cobell was at school. Apparently, Cobell, Mr. Egan saw Kier in Cobell, which is why she was awarded the Wintertide Fellowship. We know that Miss Huang is also vying for this Wintertide Fellowship, so it does beg several questions, particularly if Miss Huang is similarly from a vulnerable background, which is why she could dedicate so much of her time working for Lumen and not, being at school or playing with her friends. But time will tell the true reason for Miss Huang's presence on the seventh floor. Maybe she has an innovation of her own. So I wonder what Miss Huang's doing, but I do get the sense that being involved in the Wintertide Fellowship seems to be something for people who are not necessarily well situated in life, at least from what we see from Harmony Cobell's situation, but the story might be different. It'd be interesting to know in confirmation if Helena Egan went to the school as well, because that would just help clarify whether or not the school only is exploiting people from lower income backgrounds. All right. Sissy claims the Egans will forgive Harmony, but it's clear to see that Cobell does not believe her. After asking again for the key to Cobell's mother's room, we see Sissy rubbing a rock with Kier's face painted on it. Cobell decides to go through Sissy's room, where she successfully locates the key near a shrine with a hanger of the 9 principles and the head of the 4 tempers. She says, I found it. And again, this is one of those acting moments where it's like, I would have directed her to deliver the I found it in a different way. I know that she's trying to project to make sure that Sissy hears her, but it was still, I don't know, it felt so steeped in anger and like manic energy that I was just a little confused about what I was supposed to take by that delivery. Anyway, in Charlotte's room, and Charlotte is the name of Cobell's mother, we see a school picture, which I assume is Harmony, and then we see an old breathing machine. Cobell attaches her mother's old tube to the machine and sleeps on the bed while imitating what must have been her mother's last moments. We can infer that working in the ether factory likely contributed to her mother's breathing issue, which ultimately caused her death. Night comes and Hampton fights Sissy to check on Cobell. Hampton has to get back and Cobell tells him she needs to find something. Hampton said she'd like Cobell's mother because she hated Lumen more than she did. So it's going to be interesting to know if we ever get to know more exactly why Harmony Cobell's mother hated Lumen so much. I mean, I guess it kind of killed her, so that would be good reason enough. Anyway, Hampton asks if Cobell wants to get high, and to my surprise, she says yes. Cobell says the last time she got high was when she was 8. Again, this highlights the depravity of putting children in this environment. If you're already starting to get high at the age of 8 years old, that's definitely going to affect your development, which probably leads to the reason why the town looks as dilapidated as it did, because either you eventually died from your addiction or some other form of bad habit, or you're just kind of down on your luck. Cobell still had time to make sure that Hampton's drug selling habit, to tell Hampton that his drug selling habit was shameful. Then she kisses him. I am definitely in the camp of people who thought Hampton was some distant family member, so I was a bit shocked. But yeah, I guess 2 big blue-eyed people, big blue eyes. They got big blue eyes. That's what they got. I'm sorry about that. Big. Anyway, these people with blue eyes were kissing each other, okay? And that means they got recessive genes. Their children definitely going to have those blue eyes. Anyway, Cobell then remembers that Sissy wouldn't throw away what she's looking for, which leads her to the house's outhouse. The outhouse is no longer in use. I mean, it might be also a shed, but I'm going to just call it outhouse. But she's able to find her old Myrtle Egan School for Girls yearbook, which is actually called Annual Reminiscences. I like that. I think more yearbooks should be called Annual Reminiscences. And also, again, back to my boot thing, Mr. Milchek, I really think that they did him dirty by saying he uses big words. When they're using a yearbook, they name a yearbook for children Annual Reminiscences. And I know I pronounced that right, but I know how to spell it. Okay. In the book, we see that Harmony was valedictorian, and she was also awarded the James Egan Wintertide Fellowship. So one question I also have about this is, like, James Egan can't be that much older than them, like 10 years older. So was it truly just like this 25-year-old guy who created this fellowship with kids and then stole their ideas? That just sounds wild to me, but that does seem to be most likely what happened. I just find it really wild to think of this 25-year-old guy just walking around being like, hey, fellow kids, y'all got some ideas for me? Anyway, we see Cobell locate a head trophy with her head that is sculpted in that trophy commemorating Harmony's Wintertide Fellowship. Just a small note, I was able to catch it. She was awarded the fellowship in the Year of the Wills. The head contains Cobell's old notebook. Cobell confronts Sissy and tells her not to tell Lumen that she was at the house. Sissy claims that she cannot lie to the Egans. Sissy explains that there was no town before the Lumen factory and that Harmony's entire career comes from Lumen. Again, I would argue this was a weird delivery, but Cobell's next line are mine, my design. And so she shows the notebook to show exactly what she designed, and what we learn is that Homegirl designed the entire severance procedure, including the code. Sissy gives the notebook a flip. Cobell says that if she sought credit, she would be banished. So this is what she was told as a child when she showed these codes and these prototypes. Sissy is impressed by the notebook. So, of course, she tries to burn it. Sissy then reveals that Cobell's mother removed her tube, not Sissy. Again, a weird delivery of Patricia Arquette gives an "I don't believe you," and again, the delivery was just so erratic. I don't know. I'm being a little picky about Patricia Arquette, who is a legend and deserves all the love and praise for her portrayal of Harmony Cobell. I just felt like this episode in particular, I think there were some choices that were made that I think could have been made differently. Anyway, let's get into it. Sissy calls Cobell a weed, and then Hampton warns that someone is coming, which means that they need to leave immediately. However, Hampton doesn't join Cobell in the car. He waits at Sissy's house to confront the unknown visitor. Cobell finally answers Devon's call. Devon tells Cobell that Mark has been reintegrating, and Cobell clearly doesn't trust Regabi's skill. Mark is put on the line, and Cobell asks him to tell her everything. End of episode. So as many people know, Dieter Ether, the drug that was manufactured at Salt Snacks, is related to the name of the brother Dieter, which we learned during the Ortbo experience was the person which is how Kier discovered Woe. And I think that's super important. It does ask a question, was Kier also a child that worked at one of these factories, and how did that play a role? But I also want to say that this idea of somebody being hallucinogenic hallucinating while they're receiving a message from God is something that's quite common. It's actually a lot of non-believers' perspective on Joseph Smith. I'm also a non-believer, but I just want to point that out in case any one of you are Mormon or a member of the Latter-day Saints. People who don't follow that faith believe that basically Joseph Smith was just going through a hallucination process. But there are a lot of ways that people often describe even well-regarded religious leaders as ultimately being people who were just very hungry, having a mental episode, or just ultimately being, exposed to something like ether and kind of having that drug take it to a hallucinatory effect. Anyway, we also understand that there's a much sadder story about the invention of severance. Cobell wanted to create a reprieve for child laborers by making it so that they could live life without the memory of working. That would allow them to actually have lives that children deserve, which is supposed to be full of fun and learning. So it's a really sad thought processes, especially then when you think about how sick it is that the severance procedure basically turns adults back into children, but then it's like these children are in a perpetual state of torture. So a really sad dynamic, and I wonder if Harmony has any more in-depth belief about how severance should be ideally considered and doled out. Because if this is the perspective from which is informing how she treats the innies, it kind of doesn't make sense that she's so mean unless she feels as though she has to be mean because that's the only way that she's going to be able to have any proximity to seeing the sort of the outcome of her mastery. Anyway, the Wintertide Fellowship also seems to be an exploitative system where children's inventions and efforts are stolen by Lumen. This also highlights Lumen's interest in severed workers. Severed workers are described as childlike versions of their Audis. Children have perspectives of the world that allow them to imagine truly impactful innovations well before they are able to be implemented. So in a way, Lumen could be using severed workers to kind of like child laborers, to steal their ideas and also to get good work out of them. So maybe this kind of idea that the work is mysterious and important is really just pointing out the fact that children or the childlike version of these adults are able to to come up with inventions that might be important for Lumen in the future. Not to mention, I wouldn't be surprised that the same methodologies used to control the severed workers at Lumen were what was used during the time that Harmony Cobell worked in the factory. I really doubt Harmony is going to try to prove that she invented Severance, but it does explain why she might be able to fix any of Regabi's blunders in reintegration. So when she does get reconnected with Devin, we kind of no longer question why she's able probably to definitely understand what's happening to Mark. I do wonder if she'll mess with Mark's integration in any way, either to just so that she can get what she wants out of Lumen, because I do think that that's what's going to be important, is to keep our eyes on what Harmony Cobell ultimately wants from Lumen. And this was another still from the shrine. I just wonder what this neck bone is about and if we're going to see it again. We still haven't gotten an explanation about the goats, but we have a lot of hints from people who've watched the entire season that the goats are going to make a comeback. So maybe this neck boat has something to do with that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. This was Strategic Delusion.